The pawn shop bell rang once, sharp and thin, and Odessa Marchetti nearly dropped the velvet pouch in her hand before she caught herself. "Just these," she said, sliding the pouch across the glass counter before her nerve could fail her. The pawnbroker, a narrow man named Herschel with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. 3 rings, a pair of pearl earrings, and a thin gold bracelet caught the fluorescent light and scattered it across the counter in small, apologetic sparks. "These your husband's people?" Herschel asked, turning one ring over between his fingers. "They were my mother-in-law's originally," Odessa said. Her voice stayed even, but her hands had curled into the sleeves of her cardigan, and she pressed them flat against the counter to stop them from shaking. "My husband gave them to me when we married." Herschel glanced up at her, and something in his face softened the way it did for widows and desperate people, which by now he had learned to recognize as often the same thing. "Marcus been gone, what, 8 months now?" 9. The word came out smaller than she wanted it to. 9 months since the accident on the interstate, 9 months since the funeral where half of Chicago's South Side had turned out to grieve a man everyone agreed had been kind, and 9 months since Odessa had learned that kindness did not pay a mortgage, and that Marcus's small trucking business had died with him, buried under debts she had not known existed until the first collection notice arrived. She was 27 years old, and already selling the last physical proof that anyone had ever loved her. The shop smelled of dust and machine oil, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, the kind of small ugly sound that made the moment feel even smaller and uglier than it already did. Outside the window, traffic moved past on Halsted Street, ordinary and indifferent to what was happening inside. Herschel named a number that was less than half of what the jewelry was worth, and Odessa knew it and Herschel knew she knew it, but neither of them said anything about it, because that was simply how it worked when a person had nothing left to bargain with. "I'll take it," Odessa said. That was when the bell rang a second time. She did not turn around at first. She was too busy blinking back the tears that had been building since she walked through the door, too busy holding herself together by sheer force of will in front of a stranger's pawn shop counter. But she felt the air in the room change, the particular way a room changes when someone enters who is used to being noticed. "Take your time," said a voice behind her, low and unhurried, with an edge of iron beneath its calm. The lady was here first. Odessa turned, and found herself looking at a man who did not belong in a pawn shop on the south side of Chicago, not in the way anyone else in this neighborhood belonged there. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked poured onto him rather than worn, and his shoes alone probably cost more than Odessa's monthly rent. His hair was dark and cut close, his jaw set with the kind of stillness that suggested he rarely needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His eyes, when they met hers, were a dark amber that seemed to take in everything at once and give nothing back. She recognized him, though she had never met him. Everyone in this part of the city knew the name Han Seo-jun, even if they had never seen his face outside of whispered rumor. He ran the Korean import business 3 blocks over that everyone understood was not really about imports at all. Odessa's cheeks burned with humiliation at being seen like this, tears half dried on her face, jewelry scattered on a counter like she was some charity case. "I'm almost done," she said, and turned back to Herschel with more urgency than before. "Just give me whatever you were offering." But Seo-jun did not step back to wait his turn the way she expected. Instead, he moved closer to the counter, close enough that Odessa caught the scent of cedar and something darker underneath it, something like smoke from a fire that had long since gone out. "How much?" he asked Herschel, not looking away from Odessa's face. "Excuse me?" Herschel said. "How much were you offering her?" His voice had not risen at all, but something in it had sharpened, and Herschel's hands went suddenly careful on the jewelry. 600, Herschel said. "Give her 2,000. "Sir, I can't just." "You can," Seo-jun said. "And you will." He reached into his jacket and set a folded stack of bills on the counter, without breaking eye contact with Odessa, whose humiliation had curdled into something closer to anger. "I don't need your charity," she said sharply. "This isn't charity." Seo-jun's expression did not change, but something in his voice did, softened at the edges in a way that seemed almost involuntary. This is what those pieces are actually worth. He was about to steal from you, and I don't like watching people get stolen from. Odessa looked between the stack of bills and the man who had placed them there, torn between pride and the crushing practical reality that $2,000 would cover this month's mortgage payment and the one after it. Why do you care? She asked, quieter now. Something passed behind Seo-jun's amber eyes, brief and unreadable. Take the money, he said. Keep your jewelry. Some things shouldn't have to be sold. Herschel, sensing correctly that arguing with Han Seo-jun was not a survival strategy, quietly pushed the jewelry back across the counter toward Odessa and pocketed the bills instead. Odessa stood there for a long moment, the velvet pouch back in her trembling hands, staring at a stranger who'd just handed her more money than she'd seen in months for reasons she could not begin to understand. I don't even know your name, she lied, because saying she recognized him felt more dangerous than pretending she didn't. Seo-jun, he said. And you're Odessa, Marcus's wife. Her breath caught. You knew my husband? I knew of him, Seo-jun said carefully. Good man. Everyone said so. He paused, something flickering across his face that looked almost like old grief, wearing a stranger's expression. I make it my business to know things about people in this neighborhood, including when they're in trouble. I'm not in trouble, Odessa said, too quickly, too defensively, and the lie sat between them like something visible. Seo-jun did not call her on it directly, but his eyes moved once, briefly, to the collection notice folded into the outer pocket of her purse, its yellow envelope unmistakable, even half-hidden. Of course not, he said, and something in his tone told her he had seen exactly what she was hiding and had decided, for reasons of his own, not to embarrass her further about it. Take care of yourself, Odessa. He left as suddenly as he'd arrived, the bell ringing once behind him, and Odessa stood in the empty pawn shop holding $2,000 and a pouch of jewelry she had almost lost forever, feeling the strange, unsettling weight of having been seen by a man everyone in the city was afraid of, and finding that fear was not the only thing she felt. She told herself she would never see him again. She was wrong. 3 days later, Odessa found an envelope tucked beneath her apartment door with no return address and no explanation, only a cashier's check for $4,000 and a single line written in careful, deliberate handwriting, for the mortgage. No debts owed between us. She sat on her second-hand couch holding that check for nearly an hour, cycling between the urge to march it straight back to wherever Han Seo-jun's business operated and the desperate, humiliating awareness that this money would keep her out of foreclosure for 2 more months. Rain had started against the window, a thin gray drizzle that matched the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes, and she found herself, absurdly, angry at a stranger for being kind to her in a way that made her want to cry all over again. In the end, desperation won, though not without a fight in her conscience that kept her up half that night. She found his business address through nothing more complicated than the city directory, a converted warehouse on the edge of Chinatown that had been repurposed into something sleek and modern, glass and steel rising incongruously among the older brick buildings around it. She walked through the front doors before she could talk herself out of it, and found herself facing 2 men in dark suits who looked at her with the particular wariness of people trained to notice anyone who did not belong. I need to speak with Seo-jun, she said, with more confidence than she felt. Mr. Han doesn't take walk-ins, one of the men said. Tell him Odessa Marchetti is here about a check he shouldn't have sent. Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of recognition, and he disappeared through a door at the back of the room, returning a moment later with an expression that suggested he had been surprised by whatever answer he'd received. He'll see you, the man said, sounding faintly bewildered by his own words. Seo-jun's office occupied the top floor of the warehouse, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a stretch of the city that had never looked like it belonged to someone like Odessa. He stood when she entered, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he had been expecting exactly this confrontation. You shouldn't have sent that check, Odessa said, setting it firmly on his desk. I disagree. I'm not your charity case, Mr. Han. I told you already, this isn't charity. He moved around the desk, closing some of the distance between them, and Odessa found herself unable to step back the way every instinct told her to. Charity is something given to strangers to ease your own conscience. This is something else. Then what is it? He was quiet for a moment, and Odessa watched something complicated pass across his usually unreadable face. "There's a woman," he said finally. "Years ago, before I had this office, before I had any of this. Her name was Grace. She worked 2 jobs to support her mother's medical bills, and she never once asked me for help, though I offered many times. What happened to her? She died before I could convince her to accept it." His voice had gone quiet, controlled in the particular way that suggested enormous effort to keep it that way.
À car accident.
"Nothing to do with me, nothing to do with this life. Just bad luck on a rainy night. But I have never stopped thinking about all the ways I could have helped her, if only she had let me, if only I had insisted harder." Odessa's anger softened despite herself. "And I remind you of her. You remind me," Seo-jun said carefully, "of someone who deserves better than what the world has handed her. That is not the same thing as pity, Odessa. Do not mistake it for that." She studied him for a long moment. This dangerous, precise man standing in an office that overlooked an empire she barely understood, and found herself believing him despite every reasonable instinct that told her not to. "Keep the money," Seo-jun said, before she could argue further. "Not as charity. As an investment in not watching another person I could have helped disappear because I was too slow to act." Odessa left that office without the check in her purse, and without fully understanding why she had let him keep his way, but something had shifted between them in that room, something neither of them yet had words for. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm Odessa had not expected and told herself repeatedly she should resist. Seo-jun began appearing at moments that seemed accidental but rarely were, waiting outside the diner where she'd picked up part-time shifts to supplement the gap left by Marcus's failed business, offering to walk her to her car when the parking lot lights buzzed weak and yellow against the early dark of a Chicago autumn. "You don't have to keep doing this," she told him one evening when he appeared for the 4th time that week, leaning against a car that probably cost more than her apartment building. "I know," Seo-jun said. "I do it anyway." "Why?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she expected. "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, there is somewhere I would rather be than in that office signing off on decisions that keep men like me alive another week." It was the most honest thing he had said to her yet, and Odessa found herself, against every careful boundary she had built since Marcus's funeral, agreeing to have coffee with him the following evening. Coffee turned into dinner 2 nights later. Dinner turned into long conversations on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the city lights, conversations where Odessa found herself talking about Marcus without the usual flinch of grief, and where Seo-jun, in turn, spoke carefully, sparingly, about a childhood in Seoul before his family had moved to Chicago, about a father whose expectations had shaped him into someone who no longer recognized softness as anything but a liability. "You don't talk like a man who runs what everyone says you run," Odessa said one night, the city spread out gold and glittering below them. "I talk exactly like that man," Seo-jun said. "You have simply not yet seen the rest of him." She told herself each time that this would be the last time, that a widow rebuilding her life had no business getting entangled with a man whose business associates carried guns beneath their tailored jackets, and each time she found herself agreeing to see him again anyway. 2 weeks passed before the danger arrived, and when it did, it arrived without warning on an ordinary Tuesday evening. She was walking to her car after one such dinner, the warehouse district quiet around her, when a black sedan pulled alongside the curb and 2 men stepped out with the unmistakable posture of people who had come looking for trouble. "You're the widow," one of them said, a broad man with a shaved head and a voice like gravel. "Han's been keeping you close." Odessa's heart slammed against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." The man's smile did not reach his eyes. "Tell Han that the Vasquez family sends their regards. Tell him next time, we won't just be sending a message." Before Odessa could respond, the second man grabbed her arm, hard enough to bruise, and that was when everything happened at once. Sia-jun appeared from the shadows near the warehouse entrance, moving with a speed and precision that seemed to defy the careful, contained man Odessa had come to know over coffee and quiet conversations. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, and the man holding Odessa's arm was on the ground before she fully understood what had happened, disarmed and immobilized with an economy of motion that left her breathless for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Touch her again," Sia-jun said to the broad man, his voice gone cold and flat in a way Odessa had never heard from him, "and I will make sure the Vasquez family understands exactly what happens to people who threaten what belongs to me." The broad man's bravado wavered, but he held his ground. "She's not yours, Han. She's just some woman you're." "She is exactly what I say she is," Sia-jun said, and something in his tone made the broad man take an involuntary step backward.
"Leave. Now.
Before I decide you're not worth the message you were sent to deliver." The men retreated to their sedan, and it peeled away from the curb with a screech that echoed down the empty street, leaving Odessa standing frozen with her heart still hammering, staring at a man whose entire demeanor had transformed in the space of 30 seconds from someone gentle into something she suspected was closer to who he really was. "Are you hurt?" Sia-jun asked, his voice returning to its careful control, though his eyes still carried traces of the violence that had lived there moments before. "I'm fine," Odessa said, though her voice shook. "What was that? Who are the Vasquez family?" Sia-jun was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his amber eyes. "Rivals," he said finally. "There's a territory dispute that has been building for months. I did not want it touching you. It just did." "I know."
His jaw tightened.
"And I am sorry for that. More sorry than I know how to say." Odessa studied him, this man who had just neutralized 2 armed threats without breaking a sweat, who now stood before her looking, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain of himself. "You said I belong to you," she said quietly. Something shifted in his expression, careful and deliberate, like a man choosing his next words with the weight of consequences behind them. "I said what I needed to say to make them leave," he said. "But it was not entirely a lie." "Sia-jun, I have not felt anything close to what I feel around you in longer than I can remember," he said, the words coming out rough, almost involuntary, as if he had been holding them back through sheer will for weeks. "I told myself getting close to you was foolish. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping my distance. I was lying to myself the entire time." Odessa's breath caught. She had spent 9 months learning to survive alone, building walls around herself brick by careful brick, and here was a man dismantling them with nothing more than honesty delivered in a voice gone rough with restraint. "This is dangerous," she said, though the protest sounded weaker than she intended. "Yes," Sia-jun agreed. "It is. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not ask you to accept something you are not ready for." But Odessa, standing on a quiet street with her heart still racing from danger and from something else entirely, found herself closing the distance between them instead of retreating from it, and when Sia-jun's hand came up to gently cradle her jaw, she did not pull away. "I buried my husband 9 months ago," she said quietly. "I told myself I was done taking risks. And now I'm standing in a warehouse district, letting a mafia boss tell me I belong to him, and somehow that feels less crazy than it should." Something in Sia-jun's expression cracked open, an almost boyish relief passing briefly across his usually controlled features, and when he kissed her, it was careful at first, deliberate, as if he were giving her every opportunity to step back before he did not stop. She did not step back. The Vasquez family did not disappear after that first confrontation, and within a week, their retaliation had escalated in a way that made the danger to Odessa impossible to ignore any longer. It began with a note left on her car windshield, for words that made her blood run cold. "We know where you live." She called Sia-jun immediately, and within 20 minutes, he had arrived at her apartment with 2 of his men, his expression carved from something harder and more dangerous than she had yet seen from him. "You're not staying here tonight," he said, already moving through her apartment with the efficiency of a man assessing threats. "Pack what you need. You're coming with me until this is resolved." "Sia-jun, I have a life here.
A job.
I can't just disappear because the alternative is watching you become collateral in a war you did not choose, he said sharply, then caught himself, softening. Please, Odessa. I cannot protect you properly if you are not somewhere I can guarantee your safety. She looked at the note still clutched in her hand, at the fear that had become an unwelcome but familiar companion since Marcus's death, and made a decision that surprised even herself. Okay, she said, but I want to understand what's actually happening. All of it. No more careful half-explanations. Seo-jun studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he was weighing exactly how much truth she could bear before deciding she deserved the whole of it. The Vasquez family has controlled distribution routes on the west side for 15 years, he said, as they drove toward his residence, a converted penthouse that occupied the top 3 floors of a building overlooking the river. 6 months ago, I began expanding into territory that overlapped with theirs. It was calculated. I knew it would provoke conflict eventually. Why would you start a war on purpose? Because the alternative was staying contained forever, always smaller than I could be, always cautious. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself ambition justified the risk. I did not calculate that the risk would eventually include someone I care about. You didn't know me yet when you started this.
No, he admitted.
But I know you now. And that changes the calculation entirely. That night, in the quiet of his penthouse, Odessa found herself confronting the reality of exactly what she had chosen to become entangled with. She watched Seo-jun on the phone with his lieutenants, his voice gone flat and commanding in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the man who had disarmed 2 threats without hesitation, and she understood, watching him, that the gentleness he showed her existed alongside something far more lethal. You're not who I thought you were when we met, she said, once he'd ended the call. I never pretended to be someone else, Seo-jun said carefully. I told you what this life was. If you want to leave, Odessa, I will not stop you. I will make sure you are protected regardless, but I will not ask you to stay in a world that terrifies you. Odessa considered that offer seriously, weighing the safety of walking away against the reality of what she had felt standing on that street when he'd looked at her like she was something worth protecting, worth choosing, worth building a life around after 9 months of believing she had nothing left worth wanting. I'm not leaving, she said finally, but I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't shut me out of the danger to protect me. I've already lost one man I loved to circumstances I couldn't control. I won't lose another one because he decided I was too fragile to know the truth. Something in Seo-jun's expression shifted, a recognition passing behind his amber eyes that suggested her words had landed somewhere deep and unguarded. I promise, he said quietly, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked less like the most dangerous man in the city and more like a man who was simply, quietly, afraid of losing something he had not expected to find. The days that followed carried a strange, suspended tension, the penthouse becoming a kind of fortress, where Odessa learned things about Seo-jun's world in careful, deliberate pieces. She met Juno, his second-in-command, a quiet man with steady hands who treated her with a wary respect that Odessa understood, correctly, as an acknowledgement that Seo-jun had never brought anyone like her into this part of his life before. She learned the names of the territories under dispute, the delicate calculus of loyalty and debt that held Seo-jun's organization together, and slowly, without either of them naming it directly, she began to feel less like an outsider being protected and more like someone whose opinion mattered in the decisions being made around her. You're quiet tonight, Seo-jun said, finding her on the balcony one evening, a glass of wine forgotten in her hand as she watched the river below. I keep thinking about what Marcus would say, Odessa admitted. If he could see me now, standing in a penthouse with a man everyone in the city is afraid of. What do you think he would say? She was quiet for a long moment. I think he'd tell me to be careful. And then I think he'd tell me not to waste my life being afraid of feeling something again, just because it's complicated. Seo-jun's hand found hers on the railing, warm and certain. I would have liked to have known him. He would have hated you, Odessa said, and there was a wet laugh underneath the words. On principle. He was the most honest man I ever met. Then I am glad he is not here to see what I've become, Seo-jun said quietly, and grateful, all the same, that his absence is what brought you into that pawn shop. The confrontation with the Vasquez family came to a head 8 days later at a shipping yard on the industrial edge of the city, and Odessa refused, despite Seo-jun's every objection, to remain safely removed from what was about to happen. I need to be there, she said, as his men prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive confrontation of this territorial war. Not in the middle of the fighting, but close enough to help if something goes wrong. Absolutely not, Seo-jun said. This is exactly the kind of danger I promised to keep you away from. You promised not to shut me out. This is me choosing to be involved, not you deciding for me. The argument that followed was sharp and honest in ways that revealed exactly how much they had both come to care about the outcome, and it ended, eventually, with Seo-jun agreeing to let Odessa remain in a secured vehicle at the edge of the shipping yard, close enough to reach him if needed, far enough to remain out of the immediate line of fire. The confrontation itself unfolded with a precision that reminded Odessa, watching from the shadows of the parked sedan, exactly what kind of man she had chosen to build a future beside. Seo-jun moved through the shipping yard's chaos with the same economical violence she had witnessed on that quiet street weeks earlier, disarming threats with a calm that seemed almost supernatural given the circumstances. The night air smelled of diesel and rust, the clang of shifting metal containers echoing across the yard like something alive, and Odessa's hands stayed, white-knuckled on the tire iron she had taken from the sedan's trunk without quite deciding to. But it was the Vasquez family's leader, a lean man named Rourke Vasquez with cold gray eyes, who nearly turned the confrontation fatal, cornering Seo-jun between two shipping containers with a gun leveled and steady. "This ends tonight, Han," Rourke said. "One way or another." Odessa, watching from the sedan, understood in that instant that she was not going to remain passively removed from this danger, not when the man she loved stood one decision away from death. She moved before she fully processed the choice, slipping from the vehicle and circling wide through the shipping containers, finding herself behind Rourke Vasquez with nothing but the tire iron clutched in her trembling hands. "Drop it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, the tire iron raised. Rourke's attention split for half a second, just long enough for Seo-jun to close the remaining distance and disarm him completely, the gun clattering uselessly to the concrete. "You should not be here," Seo-jun said afterward, his voice rough with a fear that had nothing to do with Rourke Vasquez and everything to do with what might have happened to Odessa in those 30 seconds of danger. "Neither should you have been cornered without backup," Odessa said, still shaking from adrenaline. "I told you. I won't just watch you disappear because I was too afraid to act." Something in Seo-jun's carefully controlled composure finally broke entirely, and he pulled her against him with a desperation that spoke louder than any declaration he could have made in words. "You could have died," he said into her hair. "So could you," Odessa said. "That's what it means to choose someone, Seo-jun. You don't get to have all the danger and none of the risk." Rourke Vasquez, defeated and disarmed, was eventually escorted away by Seo-jun's lieutenants, the territorial dispute settled through terms Odessa did not fully understand and did not particularly need to, and in the aftermath, standing among shipping containers under a sky just beginning to lighten toward dawn, Seo-jun looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, something unguarded and entirely certain. "I have spent years building an empire I told myself was enough," he said. "I did not understand what I was missing until a widow walked into a pawn shop and reminded me what it looked like to actually want to protect something." 6 months later, the apartment Odessa had once feared losing to foreclosure sat empty, its lease transferred to a young couple just starting out, while Odessa herself had moved into Seo-jun's penthouse overlooking the river, her own modest furniture now mixed unapologetically among his sleek modern pieces in a way that had somehow made the space feel, for the first time, like an actual home rather than merely an impressive address. The Vasquez conflict had settled into an uneasy but stable peace. Territorial lines redrawn through negotiations Odessa had slowly, carefully, begun to understand and occasionally advise on, her practical mind proving useful in ways Seo-jun had not initially anticipated but had come to rely on completely. Juno, once wary of her presence, had taken to consulting her on matters of logistics that Seo-jun's organization needed handled with a delicacy his usual methods lacked, and Odessa found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not mind the work at all. She still kept Marcus's jewelry in the velvet pouch, tucked now into a drawer rather than sold away in desperation. A reminder of a love that had shaped her before this one had found her, and Seo-jun had never once asked her to put that memory away or pretend it did not matter. On a quiet evening in early autumn, standing together on the penthouse balcony overlooking a city that had once terrified her and now simply felt like home, Odessa turned to the man who had changed the entire trajectory of her grief. "I used to think losing Marcus meant I'd used up whatever luck I had left," she said. "I thought the rest of my life was just going to be about surviving what came next." Seo-jun's hand found hers, steady and certain. "And now I think maybe I just hadn't met the person who was going to remind me that surviving isn't the same as living." He did not say anything for a long moment, simply studying her face in the fading evening light with an expression that held none of the careful control he showed the rest of the world, only something quiet and complete. "I chose you the moment I saw you crying in that pawn shop," he said finally, "though I did not understand yet what I was choosing. I understand now." Odessa smiled, the particular smile of a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing and found, against every reasonable expectation, someone worth building a future beside. Some choices arrived disguised as small kindnesses. A stack of bills on a counter, a check slipped under a door. It is only later, looking back, that a person understands they were never really about the money at all. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you for spending this time with this story. If it moved you, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Until then, take care of yourself, and thank you again for being here.